Hi, this is Melinda McClymans with the Keys to Understanding the Middle East podcast, and we're live on Facebook and Periscope right now. And we have a special guest today. Professor Sean Anthony is going to talk to us about Islam and late antiquity. And he actually just published a book. It'll be out any minute now. It's called Muhammad and the Empires of Faith: The Making of the Prophet of Islam. Professor Anthony is, of course, at Ohio State University in Near Eastern Languages and Cultures. His specialties are early Islam and late antiquity, Islamic thought, classical Arabic literature. He actually got his, wait a minute, I thought I had education up. Yes, here it is. So he got his PhD from the University of Chicago. With honors from Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. And his languages include Arabic, Persian, Syriac, French, and German. And so he's got classes at Ohio State in advanced Arabic, but he's also teaching about kind of the intellectual history of Islam and antiquity and kind of that cultural context of when Islam was born. He's an expert in that, so I'm super excited to have him. Be sure to check out his Twitter feed too. He's got a lot of great snippets from his research on there. So, okay. So, anything else I should add to your bio, Professor Anthony?
No, I think that sounds pretty good. It pretty much covers it. Thank you for the intro, though.
You're welcome. Yeah, I thought, because we have a really broad audience, it'd be great to just start with a definition of the word hadith and what that means.
Okay. So essentially, Islam has two principal scriptural sources. One of them is considered to be eternal, qadim. This is the Qur'an. And the other one is considered to be newer, hadith. But hadith is also different from the Qur'an, as the Qur'an is regarded to be the word of God, whereas the hadith is regarded to be the words of the Prophet. And so one of the things that distinct the hadith from the Qur'an, well, there are many things, but one of them is that whereas the Qur'an is supposed to be the register, the collection of the words revealed to the Prophet Muhammad through the angel Gabriel, the hadith are the things that the Prophet said, approved of, he did, kind of experiences and teachings, experiences with his companions, teachings to his companions, as preserved by his community. They're particularly important in Sunnism, but they also play a role in Shia Islam as well. So what I would say briefly is that the hadith are just the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, in addition to the scriptural corpus of the Quran, that serve as kind of the authoritative guide for life, ethics, kind of law, and what normatively is kind of Islam and all of its kind of various aspects.
Okay, excellent.
That's clear.
So, I was really struck actually by something that you posted on Twitter about a hadith. It kind of, expanded my knowledge on what that word means, I think.
Yeah.
It's an account of a conversation between Moses and Adam. Am I understanding that right?
So which one is this? I don't remember which one it is in particular. So what are they talking about?
Adam defends himself against Moses' reproach and bests him by noting that he did not help to disobey God, for thus it was written, i.e. foreordained. Jubai notes that if Adam's argument is valid, any sinner may cite the same excuse. Thus he struck his challenger dumb.
Yeah, this is a pretty famous example. So one of the things that you get a lot with the hadith, and by the way, one should kind of be clear about the nature of kind of in terms of its authenticity and the types of authority that it carries. So the Quran, for one, is a pretty small corpus compared to the hadith. The hadith, if you look at any collection, they go over multiple volumes, and if you collect them all together, they are many tens of volumes. I mean, maybe even up to 100, depending on the editor and the collection, how big they put the print size. And of this kind of corpus, all of them have different gradations in terms of their authenticity and their value and things like that. And some of them are kind of more geared towards kind of popular understandings of prophets, prophetic history, pre-Islamic history. They feature stories of prophets of old. According to Muslim belief, the first prophet was actually the first human being also, that is Adam.
Okay.
And so this one belongs to that genre, right? And the idea is usually prophets are regarded as being protected from committing sin. And everybody call it ma'soom. Sometimes you see it translated as infallible. It doesn't really mean infallible in terms of they can't make mistakes. It's just that God gives them a special kind of gift in a way to where he protects them from making any grave error. And one of the reasons for this is because they are sources of guidance and models for humanity to emulate. And so you can't have a faulty model. So God prevents them from becoming kind of overly faulty. But of course, one of the most curious examples of this is Adam, because if Adam is a perfect person and worthy of emulation, all this other stuff, what do you do with the fact that he fell from paradise? Because of course, both he and his spouse, they end up disobeying God, and this leads to their fall from the garden and our current, I guess, sorry state here on earth. And so, what this hadith does is it kind of imagines this scenario in which kind of Moses and Adam are in a conversation with one another, and of course, Moses is telling Adam, that he's not so great of a guy because he disobeyed God. Okay. And so that's kind of the point of the dialogue. And the question is like, well, how will kind of Adam respond? And part of the response is touches on kind of somewhat sensitive theological issues, like, do human beings really have free will? Right? Was Adam predestined from all time to have fallen, or did he actually have a choice in the matter? Right. And so a lot of times these theological questions are kind of embedded inside the story format, right?
They're kind of like between the lines.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not explicitly stated, but and so one of the things that's nice about this type of way of doing theology through storytelling is, one, it works a little bit differently from, say, your typical creedal formation that you have to say, like, I believe that, there's one God and there's no God but he. Whereas it's like, you have to believe this is blah, blah, blah. When you're dealing with a little bit more difficult issues, like predestination and things like that, you're in essence given a little bit more wiggle room in a story, right? The story doesn't necessarily tell you this is what you ought to believe and things like that.
Yeah.
It has kind of fuzzy edges, and it leads itself open to interpretation a lot more, kind of wiggle room.
That's interesting. I never thought of storytelling in that way. That's a definite, like a teaching use for storytelling that's pretty sophisticated.
Yeah, it is.
It's not like, it's a little different from just like, what's the moral of the story? It's kind of like, what are the implications of the story? Or huge philosophical question.
Exactly. Yeah.
Free will. I mean, we're still asking that in terms of science now, So that's
it's a perennial. This is one of the things that I think is fascinating and compelling about theology, theological problems, and I think why they have kind of continued relevance for studying, right, is because, well, even if you are not a person of faith, even if you are not a person that is necessarily interested in settling these things in theological terms, because that's not, say, important to you, theological questions actually bring up profound philosophical issues that relate to perennial questions. And a lot of times the theologians that actually did address these issues provided some of the most interesting answers, because they were often themselves kind of Renaissance men. Unfortunately, rarely they were women. That increases later on as we get more closer to the modern period. But they kind going to pose some pretty novel solutions to these when they're kind of wearing their theologian's cap or their philosopher's cap. And it's not as if the problems that they address, if we remove, say, God from the equation, that all of a sudden it's not a problem. I mean, for the theologian, the issue with whether or not you have free will, the question is, does God's foreknowledge of what's going to happen mean that you don't have a choice, that the future is already predetermined, right? And so if you take God's foreknowledge out of the equation and say, just think about in terms of physics, right? If you think in terms of whether or not we live in a kind of a deterministic universe that can be predicted by physics in any way, or even if you think about like time dilation and all this other stuff, like the idea that your past is different from someone else's past, traveling at a different speed or traveling near the speed of light and things like that. What that means is that your future and your past in some way is already exists, right? Or maybe still exists for somebody else. So these questions between kind of physics and theology and all sorts of, they still exist, and they're still alive, even if you put aside the theological assumptions.
Wow, that is profound. Yeah, I mean, and the thing is too, philosophy, it is still relevant today. Like, and it was then as well. Like this hadith didn't occur in a vacuum, right? Like there was a discourse at the time that probably shape the reader's interpretation of it, or am I reading too much into it?
No, I mean, so there is a long standing debate in kind of Islamic theology. One of is do human beings have capacity for free will? Now, how this is explained in popular literature, or even like in your everyday mosque that you'll encounter, is one thing. But if you look at the scholastic literature, you tend to have two views, and which is like, what? Yes and no, we don't. And in general, to oversimplify things a bit, the standard view, the Sunni view, tends to be that no, human beings do not have free will. That every act that we commit is created by God. I should be careful actually using that word free will, but the idea is whether or not we create our own acts, that every act is created by God, and by performing it, we acquire its kind of responsibility for which we'll be judged. But we ourselves, we don't create our own acts. And then you have other views by kind of extinct schools of thought like the Mu'tazila, or at least nearly extinct, that subsequently are adopted by the Shia, that believe that we do have a form of free will and things like that. And the way in which people would argue these questions were not merely in the realm of, say, philosophical thinking and things like that, but they'd also use stories to argue them. So that hadith about the debate between Moses and Adam, right? Again, I might as well just read it. It makes it a little simpler. It says that according to this. No, it's all right. I'll just read it out loud. I have it in front of me, but I mean, you could do that too if you want. But so Abu Huraira is the one that reports it, a famous companion of the Prophet. He says there's an argument, and he quotes the messenger of God, that is the Prophet Muhammad, is saying there's an argument between Adam and Moses, and Adam got the better of Moses. Moses said to him, "Are you the same Adam who misled the people, calls them to get out of paradise, etc.?" Right, so he blames Adam for doing all these bad things. And Adam said, "You are the same Moses whom God gave knowledge of everything and selected him amongst his people as a messenger." And he said, "Yes." And then Adam then again said, "Even then you blame me for something which had been ordained for me before I was created." That is, he just says to Moses, you have been given a kind of a great gift. God chose you. And even despite the fact that you were given a great gift by being chosen by God to kind of deliver his message in the Torah, etc., you still have you're not kind of checking your privilege, I guess. You still have the temerity to criticize me for something that was predestined for me before I was even created, before anything was even created. And so it gets to this issue of moral responsibility, predestination, and things like that, right? And one of the major issues will be, if I can't, choose what I'm going to do, how am I morally culpable for it? I mean, the same thing comes. This is explored. I think multiple issues, right? Like if ever science discovered, for example, that a human behavior could be totally predicted via algorithm or something like that. I think there's a TV show that recently did that. I think it's Westworld. They found the world the way. Yeah, it's like I think the most recent season of Westworld, this supercomputer found a way to predict people's lives and all sorts of stuff, that knew whether they're going to commit crimes and stuff like that. Also, yeah, Minority Report does this.
Minority Report, I love that movie.
Yeah, and so the question is like, should people be held culpable for crimes that they can't really help but commit? Should you put someone in jail if their brain chemistry forces them to do it?
If God creates our actions, like according to the Sunni perspective on I guess free will, God creates our actions. Are they our actions?
Yeah.
Why are they? Why are we responsible for them? I guess.
Yeah.
But I guess I always understood that as God has a plan, but that plan can change, right? I mean, it's not like we understand.
Well, no. the typical line is like, no, God's plan is never. So the Shiite view is that God can change his plan.
Okay.
But they call this doctrine Bada, right? But the idea for usually is that God sees every moment. He knows how it's all going to unfold. It's already happened as far as he's concerned. It's just a really strange way of thinking about time and all sorts of stuff like that. But for like the typical Ash'ari view, so the main school of theology that comes up with this view is named after this guy named Al-Ash'ari. And he basically says that, God knows what we're going to do before we do it. But the fact that we do it anyway, we end up acquiring kind of the moral culpability or moral praise for the good deeds and the bad deeds that we have. He actually has a really famous story which is told about him. He has a teacher named Abu Ali Jubai, which I think I mentioned in that tweet. And in that, Ash'ari is a student of his, and he disagrees with Jubai's view, which is that human beings have free will. And he tells this parable. It's called the parable of the three brothers. And hopefully I think I can retell it correctly. Hopefully I get it right. And so as the story goes, you have three brothers, and they all die. They all enter the afterlife. And it sounds like the setup of a cheesy joke, but it's actually an interesting argument. But in any case, they all enter the afterlife. Yeah. And the first brother is a righteous individual. And so he's dedicated his life to doing righteous deeds, and he has all sorts of good deeds that he brings with him into the afterlife, for which he gets rewarded. So not only does he get entrance into paradise and eternal felicity, but he also is granted a high rank among the blessed in the afterlife. So good for him. Yeah. And then he had the second brother, and he's the ne'er-do-well. He's not the good guy of the family. He did bad deeds. He didn't sufficiently repent or anything like that. So he is kind of destined for hell. Bad news for him. Okay. But you have a third brother, but unlike the other two brothers, he doesn't live his entire life. Well, he doesn't live a normal human lifespan. The first two brothers did. This brother dies in infancy. Okay. And because this brother dies in infancy, the brother does not reach the age of accountability. However, imagine that to be 12, 13, whatever. And so he gets a free pass. He gets an entrance into paradise. However, unlike the first brother, he doesn't get sort of the exalted station that the first righteous brother gets, because he doesn't have so many good deeds. And so the third brother, he complains. He says, it's not my fault that I wasn't given a full lifespan and given the opportunity to do works of charity and good works and stuff like that. So why are you not letting me go to the exalted stations of paradise? And basically it said to him, well, you should just be grateful, because what God knew is that were you to have a lengthy lifespan, you would have been unrighteous like your second brother. And so what happened is God showed you mercy, and he allowed you to die as an infant. And now you're spending eternity in paradise rather than eternity in the inferno, right? So, oh, great, lucky. But then the second brother, he chimes in, and he says, wait a minute. If you knew my brother, the third brother, was going to be a sinner and go to hell, and so you let him die early, why didn't you do the same for me? You let me live my whole lifespan, and now I am stuck in hell for eternity. So the story is not meant to demonstrate that the idea of heaven and hell is stupid or anything like that. What it's supposed to do, and one of the reasons why Ashari tells the story, is it's supposed to point out a key point of incoherence in a kind of very simple notion of kind of human beings have free will and God lets them go. And it's just supposed to point to a problem. And so for Ashari's solution is that it doesn't have to do with any of the explanations, is that whatever your fate is in the afterlife is what God preordained to you, and he's sovereign, he's just, and that's what he decided. And you really can't complain because you're just a created thing and he's the creator. And so that's that.
I muted myself because there was some leaf blower in the background. Then I forgot I muted myself. But yeah, basically, it's like the situation and the pandemic that we're in. But yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, it's kind of like the cards you're dealt, sort of an idea.
Yeah. It's you might think of it like the cosmic justice problem, right? Which not everyone has equal abilities, or not everyone has equal this and that, even from the very beginning of their life, right? And who is to blame for what seems to be that injustice, right? Why are some people born beautiful, some are born ugly, some are born in poverty, some are born in riches, and things like that.
Yeah. So just kind of like those profound, why is the sky blue kind of questions.
Yeah, exactly.
We've been asking.
Exactly. Yeah, theologians always have an answer to it. It's like they'll always be like, "Oh, it's so you'll be grateful, right?" You look at how miserable someone is, and then you feel grateful, right? It reminds me of like the Johnny Cash song, where he's talking. It's like about having a satisfied man. It's like not one rich man in 10 has a satisfied mind, and so it's the idea of the poor. They may look at the rich and things like that. It's like, oh, if only I had, money and things like that. And then Johnny Cash, he goes boom and bust. He's like, I was rich and I've lost every dime, but I can tell you I'm richer by far with a satisfied mind. And so the idea is like the rich, they have their more money, more problems issues, and the poor, they have their no money, a lot of problems issues, but they're kind of given different gifts. And you kind of observe the differences in society, and through difference, you learn kind of gratitude.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's just always remarkable to me, just all the like how things change, but it is remarkable how things stay the same over time. Like certain, though there's a lot of arguments these days over like cultural discourses, and whether they matter and all that stuff. And I really think I'm of the camp that says they do matter, but you just have to think of them with a broad perspective. There's always been certain conversations we've had, in the academic community or just in like culture. Like we tell these stories to kind of cement what our group thinks about that's particular question. So in some ways they had it much better because we have too many stories,
too many voices, too many stories to tell. Yeah. To me, like one of the miracles is that these kind of texts, these people that live like forever ago, live in a total different geography, whether or not we have a personal connection to that tradition, that language, the religion, you name it, that they can speak to us, across all sorts of boundaries, and that we find kind of this common humanity with them, even though, it always takes effort to understand and to empathize and to learn not to presume that you understand. Sometimes we presume we understand more than we think we do, right? That somehow,
sure. Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, like sometimes our personal connection somehow gives us a little bit of a magic insight into something. For me as an American, like I know, like what's my father's family is from, like west of the Cumberland Gap or whatever. It's like just because I come from that background doesn't give me any sort of magical insight into what their life was like in 19th century America, right? But at the same time,
totally,
that might make me interested in that. That might be kind of the pull that brings me into thinking about those questions. And so we all kind of enter these corpora. We all encounter these traditions and things like that from where we're at. And I think we should be cognizant of that, like where we're coming from and where they're coming. All that stuff is going on.
Yeah, and that there are universals. And then there are particulars in every, every setting, every human setting. There's universals that are very transferable to other minds, other places, other times, but then there are particulars that totally aren't. Okay. And that actually reminds me of your job talk when you first came to Ohio State. It was about crucifixion.
Yeah, that's right. Wow.
Really not.
Yeah.
I guess I don't know if that's a good example or not, but there's certain there's an yuck factor when it comes to cultural differences, for certain practices or certain ideas that you just have to admit is there and learn from. There's differences. Yeah.
So for that one, so how I even got started on the topic is a little bit of an interesting story. So that all started at UChicago, where I was assigned to read this interesting compilation. It's an old book, the biographies of the kind of great scholars of the Sunni tradition that suffered. They suffered something, right? So something bad happened to them, and it's called Kitab al-Mihan, which means the book of trials, right? And it's not always. Sometimes the people die. Not always do they die. But if you go through that, you have stories about people that were imprisoned, people that were lashed, all sorts of horrible things happen to them, usually related to their beliefs or standing for a principle or something. And I was really surprised that I read the book of that. They had an entire section dedicated to people who were crucified.
Yeah.
I was like, what? How does that? I thought crucifixion was gone by the time that Constantine converted to Christianity or whatever he did. Which turned out not to be the case whatsoever. Crucifixion survived. It survived under the Romans in a different form. And also what I learned is that what people called crucifixion, when we think of crucifixion, I think we moderns, contemporary folks, we tend to have the iconography of Christianity emblazoned in our minds. Right? We kind of see Jesus on a cross or something like that. But by far, most people that encounter crucifixion from this time period, late antiquity, whatever, of course they have the image of Jesus, but crucifixion could mean a wide array of other things too. Unpleasant things, right? And which they're never like, oh, it's actually not. They're all equally unpleasant, but it's very similar to things
and brutal. And wow.
Yeah. It reminds, some of them reminds me of the pirate stories. I don't know, gibbeting, where they would take a pirate and they when the tide was out, I don't know if this really happened. As a historian, I don't know, because it's not my period. So sorry if I'm spreading fake news or whatever. But where they put the pirate in the cage when the tide was out, and when the tide came in, of course it would drown them. But they leave the body out there so as a warning, right? And this is a pretty common thing in general. You punish the worst criminals. Yeah. Exactly. It's like deterrence. And that's where the legal debates come in, is whether or not you should only use it as a deterrence for others, or as you deny a body burial.
Totally. I lived in Saudi Arabia, and that was a very common kind of justification. People would say, well, we don't have any crime though, so it's great,
Yeah.
I don't know if that's even true, but people definitely believed it was.
Yeah. It's hard to know, what's one of the things that is difficult, I think, even as historians, where you kind of collect this stuff, like how do you make a claim like something like that? Like how much crime is there? And then who gets to count as a crime, right? Like you just count people that are murdered, but a lot of people are murdered by the state too. People are murdered on the battlefield. Like what counts and how these things are drawn and where you get your numbers from it's always kind of a big challenge.
Yeah.
The numbers could be very high sometimes, unfortunately.
Well, and we're not far from Terre Haute right here,
Yeah.
Well, actually, I don't know physically where you are, but I assume you're somewhere.
I'm relatively close. Yeah.
And Terre Haute's where the executions are still happening fairly regularly, and they're pretty brutal, but they're just more like clinical or like medicalized, than back then. But they're still
at least so they claim, right? So.
Yeah, they're still pretty brutal, but they don't have quite as much of a crowd. I don't think they have as large.
Yeah, that would be the big difference.
Kind of viewing, but it's a small theater rather than. I don't know. Actually, I'm curious. I wonder how big that room is where people can view it.
Well, they don't have it on the 10 o'clock news, right?
No, they don't. Yeah, they don't televise it. They don't do that in Saudi Arabia either, where they could, but people, it's in a square, so people can gather around, kind of like the traditional way for an execution. So, nice topic.
Yeah, I know. I was like, whoa, what from being eternally damned to hell to public executions?
No, but it's actually a really good
That's
example
my plot.
In terms of like cultural differences. Like there's surprisingly the same and different, like in terms of what the role of execution. There's many things like that you can use as a lens to compare different times and places, and so that's, I think, the really exciting thing about studying different world areas is like taking broader perspectives and looking over time, and through like really well-wrought analytical lenses, like if you really understand a practice like crucifixion or execution and then say, oh, let's really pull this apart and think about it. But we should probably turn on to less morbid things. So,
okay. I got a lot of crucifixion material. So give me
So definitely we could do a follow-up. Actually, it would be awesome to do a follow-up with some other faculty members on like burials, like do something on death, like maybe do it around Halloween or something. That would be really fun. Because we've got archaeologists at OSU. We've got a lot of people doing work on the Middle East that I bet we could have like a great conversation about things having to do with death. But but I don't want to get too far before mentioning you just published a book about Muhammad and the Empires of Faith. And that, definitely connects to what we've been talking about in terms of like his cultural context and the cultures of these different Islamic empires. Is there anything, you'd care to share about like maybe aha moments about the different cultures you studied when you were doing the research?
Yeah. Okay. I can give a little perspective on that, I guess. So basically what the book is, in summary, is it's basically entering into a debate about how much we can know about the Prophet Muhammad. And also I hope that it kind of brings people up to speed about the amount of historical evidence that we have about his life and those of his early followers. And a lot of times you hear sort of this canned presentation about how the source material that we have is not very rich. It's very difficult. We can't learn a lot about them. And I'm basically saying just the opposite. I'm trying to kind of change the impression. So actually we have a great deal of material about that's early and that's rich about the Prophet Muhammad's life. And I'm also trying to show how the earliest accounts written about him, I guess I should clarify that the earliest accounts of the Prophet Muhammad's life are not in the Qur'an. The Qur'an doesn't have a lot of narratives like that. It's sort of like if for those who haven't read the Qur'an, and something like reading the Psalms and trying to reimagine the life of King David and Solomon through the Psalms. It would be very difficult, right? So you need extra materials. And this is the Hadith, where the Hadith come in. But you have a special genre of the Hadith called the Sirah, and that tells like the story in a chronological form.
Like S-I-R-A?
Yeah, the Sirah.
Okay.
Yeah, S-I-R-A. Mm-hmm. I put an H at the end. It's optional, but I always put the H at the end.
Okay.
But so it's like, where's this genre come from? Why does it look like it does? And all sorts of things like that. So one of the main arguments that I try to make there is that the genre is a type of epic literature on the one hand, and it's also a type of hagiographic literature on the other. And I'll explain what both of those mean.
Okay.
So epic literature is sort of like the closest parallel from the region, I guess, would be the Shahnameh, the Persian Book of Kings. And basically the Persian Book of Kings, what it does is it takes humanity's primeval history, like the first human beings ever, and then the first kings and all kind of what the kings taught humanity, like smithing and how to make clothes and how to cook food, like just basically everything that goes into civilization. And it follows kind of this epic history of the Persian people and also the people of Tehran, which are the nomads, all the way up to the Islamic conquest. So it's a big, huge epic history, large in scale, goes from the beginning of human history until the Islamic conquest. And there's a lot of epic histories that we have, a lot of epic stories. They tend to be at grand scale. A lot of times they focus on individual heroes, but sometimes they focus on a series of heroes. Like the Arthurian legends would be an example of kind of epic things. Like Homer would be an example of epic literature. And then hagiography is the other one. Hagiography just really means writing about holy persons or writing about saints. And these could be kind of stories about miracle workers, stories about monks, stories about hermits, stories about, holy people that were well known and well regarded for their piety, for their good deeds, and also for their miracles. And sometimes they have very seedy origins, like they can be people that I don't want to single out like the women, but one of the more famous genres, one of those famous character types in this genre is a woman that lives her life as a prostitute and then has a big conversion moment, and then lives the rest of her life as being like a holy person dedicated to God alone and things like this. So a lot of times they're redemption narratives, but not always.
Okay.
So these are very popular stories about the past. They shape how people view the past and how they understand the moral arc of history, and where they understand the moral arc of history to be heading. And they also set expectations of what holy people look like, how they act, what happens to them. Like holy people, for example, get visited by angels. They fight demons, and it's like the typical tropes. And so what I'm arguing is that the Sirah literature was, in essence, written in a style that was meant to compete with and to match kind of the epic histories and the hagiographical literature of the late antique world, the stuff that you get written in Greek and Syriac and Coptic and Persian, stuff like that. Like this literature was competing for the eyes and the attention of the elites. Yeah.
And what was the time frame literature?
So the time frame for this literature, for the most part, so the Prophet Muhammad dies in the year 632, and we start to have our first examples of this literature. I mean, they're mostly pretty small at the beginning in the 690s, so 60 years later. But we don't have our first great compilation of like this huge history. So one of the most famous books literally goes from the creation of the universe all the way to the era of the caliphs. And that's written by a guy named Ibn Ishaq, so probably sometime around 750 to 767, in which he dies. So it's over 100 years.
Ibn Ishaq is a writer of hadiths, right? Or
he's sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
He's one of the hadith sources, right?
Yeah. He's if you're going to read. Okay. So he was a hadith scholar, but it's like Sirah is like a subgenre of hadith. Some people separate it off as totally different, but it's very familiar. And so if you're going to read a biography of the Prophet Muhammad, you're going to probably read Ibn Ishaq's. This is actually a little bit of a problem from my perspective as a historian, because people mostly only read Ibn Ishaq or think that Ibn Ishaq only survives in a certain way. And so what I've spent the last few years doing is trying to show folks that Ibn Ishaq is not a historical bottleneck. That is, there are other sources besides him that we can read that we can take the stories of the Prophet Muhammad from. And one of the translations that I published is a book called The Expeditions. It's written by a guy by the name of Muhammad ibn Rashid. He's a contemporary of Ibn Ishaq, and he wrote this thing called the Kitab al-Maghazi, or the Expeditions. And it's a shorter, much more humble, meager biography of the Prophet Muhammad, but it represents a different type of account than what you find in Ibn Ishaq. And I kind of argue you can do that with a number of other figures and sort of kind of broaden the source base. They're all relatively late. They really start writing and putting down this material in basically 1 century after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. So they are difficult to work with as historically, and so their historicity is open to question in many cases. And so part of the book is dedicated to, like, how do you deal with that? What are some strategies that historians can use and things like that?
So, what are your strategies? Do you mind such an open-ended question?
No problem. That's no problem at all. So what I try to do is one, set out what I think is an important hierarchy of sources. So when thinking about, say, if you want to write about the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad and that is his companion, so anything before 632, what are all the sources that are available to you, and how should you grade their importance? How should you weigh them in evidentiary terms? So there's 4 main groups. So the first group would be the Qur'an. And like I said, the Qur'an is a very challenging document to read historically. I think that you can read it historically, but it's hard to get a chronology out of it. Like, you can learn all sorts of stuff about the Prophet Muhammad and his early community, like the things that they are interested in, for example, and sometimes even specific events like the Hijra or battles and stuff like that. But also some of the Prophet Muhammad's experience with his visions of Gabriel and things like that is in there too. And you get an idea of his teachings too, like, the focus on justice, the focus on basically rededicating Mecca to the worship of one God on the model of Abraham and things like that. You get a lot of material, I think, from the Quran, even though you don't have, say, necessarily a strict chronology. And then source number 2 would be archaeological and material evidence. So archaeology is not very good for studying an individual. Because archaeology works on kind of a large scale. So if you look at most archaeological data, it will give you kind of broad brushstrokes of historical change, but it won't, like, there's really no such thing as the archaeology of an individual unless you find his body or something like that. And we don't, of course, have anything like that with the Prophet Muhammad. But what we do have that archaeology does reveal is something called epigraphy. And so epigraphy is kind of the study and the kind of collection of things that people write on stone or other media. It doesn't have to necessarily be stone. It also can be like mosaics and stuff like that. These are things like that people, like, if you are like hiking or something and you see people scrawl on like a concrete bridge or into a tree, Johnny and Jim were here, or Susie and Sally, 1997 or something like that. We get all sorts of graffiti like this from the ancient world as well. And actually it tends to wax and wane. It's weird. We call it the epigraphic habit. We have some centuries as boom, and then the next century will be nothing, silence. Then the century after that, boom, again. Well, it just so happens that we have a relatively good boom in Arabic epigraphy right after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. And so we can get a good sense of how the Quran was received, how the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad was received from the inscriptions of people that are, for the most part, everyday people, but are just kind of writing down prayers and leaving their names and things like that. Sometimes they put the date, sometimes they don't, but they say things like, "O Lord, forgive me of my sins and grant me paradise as a place of eternal abode, and let me be near to the Prophet," or something like this. And sometimes it doesn't mention Muhammad directly. But what we can notice is that the language that they're using is kind of relying on the Quranic idiom. That is, sometimes they're citing the Quran directly, or they're using words that are very common in the Quran. And so it's a really great piece of evidence that the Prophet Muhammad's revelation, right, has influenced the religiosity of everyday people, and we can tell this through the graffiti that they live behind. We have also official inscriptions, by the way, too, in which caliphs, they build something. The most famous example of this is the Dome of the Rock, and they put like a big inscription on it, right? And they say, "I built this, and I'm great and wonderful," and things like this. So that's number two. Number three is we don't have many of these, but we have a number of very early accounts of the Prophet Muhammad and his life and his preaching that are preserved not in the Arabic historiography, but rather in the historiography and the writings of the conquered peoples. Most of the Middle East at the time, what we call the Middle East at least, the Eastern Mediterranean, North Africa, Iraq, etc. They did not speak Arabic for the most part. There were Arabic speakers in all those territories, but most the literary medium was not Arabic. It was mostly Greek, Syriac. If you go up north of the Caucasus, or Armenian, if you're in Egypt, Coptic, things like this, they write accounts of what it was like to be conquered in the 7th century, and sometimes they make mention of Muslim practice. Sometimes, even more rarely, they make mention of the Prophet Muhammad. And we get early accounts of who they think the Prophet Muhammad is. A lot of times they don't realize he's a prophet, but they say interesting things. And for the most part, when they are good sources, and I think a lot of them are, they're clearly relying upon a source. So say that probably one of the most famous examples is an Armenian historian named we call him Sabius. We really don't know who he is, so we call him Pseudo Sabius. And he knows all sorts of interesting things about the Prophet Muhammad. He knows that he's he's writing in the 660s, so 3 decades after the Prophet Muhammad's death. And he knows, for example, that the Prophet Muhammad is a lawgiver. He knows that he was a trader at one time in his life. He knows that he forbids the consumption of pork. He knows that he forbids the consumption of wine and a couple of other things. And he says that he got his information from people that came from Palestine. And so he's kind of not just a witness of – he's not just like making things up. We know this. He's also a witness of what type of knowledge was circulating about the Prophet Muhammad at this time. So a lot of times it seems that these folks have Muslim informants, and so we get an idea of what Muslims were saying about the Prophet Muhammad, his life, and salient features about him, even though we're reading
Muslim
Christian sources.
Themselves.
Yeah, but they're exactly.
More just like, are they looking at him as kind of a military commander, or...
So it depends upon the author, and some of them are more accurate than others. So, I mean, they have to be read critically like anything else. But so our earliest one actually is a record that falls within the first decade of the Prophet Muhammad's life. And it's a very poorly preserved kind of scribble on the front of a book. And it mentions battles. It mentions kind of Arabs raiding. It mentions people dying, and it mentions Romans fleeing, and it mentions a battle at a place called Gabitha, which is the location of what's called the Battle of Yarmouk. In Arabic sources, this is the main decisive battle between the early kind of Arabian conquerors and the armies of the Eastern Roman Empire that led to their withdrawal from Syria. And he's a contemporary, right? And he says he mentions the name Muhammad a couple of times. Because it's so poorly preserved, we don't really know what he says about Muhammad per se. All that we know is that he associates them with these early conquests, and that Muhammad's name is kind of circulating in the air, right? That people have heard of Muhammad at a really early date. So if you would get, so from like a historian's perspective, sometimes especially when it comes to do with like early founders of religion, you get folks that kind of have kind of odd theories, like, well, so-and-so never existed or something like this. So if you are purely arguing from like a forensic basis, this would be a really important document to show you. Yeah, definitely there was a guy named Muhammad that existed, and we have kind of evidence for him very early on, and he's mentioned. But the earliest person to mention him doesn't say, oh, these people say that he's a prophet. We actually get a lot of mention of people writing in Syriac and Armenian especially, that say that Muhammad is regarded by the conquering Arabs, and mostly they call them Arab, as a lawgiver. But we really don't get them making this connection of the Arabs regarding him as a prophet until like 60 years after his death, like in the 690s.
That's not incorrect, right? He was
well. So in the Qur'an, he's called a prophet, and he's called a messenger, right? So he's called a Rasul, and he's called a Nabi. Yeah. So I would say that the Qur'an is very clear about like who he is, what his role is vis-a-vis the community. Okay. But what these sources allow us to do is to get a gauge in at least some way. It's like, what did your everyday person that was living in the region at the time that lived through these conquests? How much of awareness did they have of what movement was upon them, right? So we kind of get an idea of this kind of new elite, this conquest elite. We get an idea of what they knew and what their attitude is from the graffiti that they left behind in Arabic, right? So that's one perspective. And then the stuff that's written in Syriac, Armenian, and Greek, and so on and so forth, that gets us more of a perspective of what the conquered folks perceived and what they knew and how they kind of experienced things. So it's interesting to see what they say. And they're definitely very partial. We by no means have a perfect record of what everybody knew and what everybody thought. And we wish we had more. But I think what is there is pretty striking. So anyway, that was number 3. So number 4 source is then finally that Syria literature. And so what I basically advocate is try to make as systematic as possible picture of these early sources that date to the 7th century, so basically the 600s, and then use that as kind of a baseline of this is good historical knowledge. This is what we can know with pretty good deal amount of certainty about the Prophet Muhammad. Take that baseline certainty and then look at the Syria literature and see what else you can learn.
And they would have all been after he passed away, correct?
So there are many. So ostensibly, if you look at this literature, it has a really interesting feature. And this one of the things that is fascinating about early Arabic historiography, the Hadith literature, all this literature is they tend to cite their authorities. So even though they are preserved at a much later date, they'll contain a list of names. They'll say, this person told me, that person told me. In the best case scenario, it will go all the way back to someone who met the Prophet Muhammad himself.
Right.
Whether or not that's fictitious or actually real is a matter of scholarly debate, both in traditional Muslim scholarship and modern scholarship.
Interesting. Well, we've got a question, so I don't want to neglect our very motivated 3 people we got here with us. So this is from Ahab Sagala, and he asks, in what context does Dr. Anthony use the word making in the subtitle of the book? Is it about how the writers of Sirah portray the prophet? Is it about how the hadiths themselves do? Is it something else, or is it a combination of viewpoints?
Yeah, that's a good question. So really the making of part is the idea of kind of your image of a person, the image of their significance, like what goes into the making of that. So all sorts of kind of sources feed into your image and understanding of a person. And so what the book is about in many ways is how the image of the Prophet Muhammad that we get in, say, the Sirah literature, like what goes into that, and then also what goes into the making of the image of the Prophet Muhammad using the methods of modern historians too. Okay, so it's about multiple versions of, or multiple receptions of the person of Muhammad, and understanding the process that goes behind the making of that image. Very cool.
I've learned a lot today.
Yeah, thank
you. How these information sources coalesce and give you an image, or like a view, a 360 view, as much as you can get. And kind of, it's almost like making a hologram, and you're like, oh, it's kind of appearing there. I don't know.
the metaphor I use is I say like the early sources, they give us a low resolution view of Muhammad.
Yeah.
And I basically talk about the possibility of increasing the resolution if we use the Syriac literature. And so if you take the Syriac literature at its word, the Hadith corpus at its word, I mean, we have a perfect view of the Prophet. Right? So we know everything about him. We know,
right.
how he put on his shoes in the morning. We know how he put on his pants. We know how he washed. We know just everything. So there is. I don't want to give the sense that there is 100% agreement between kind of historians and kind of the traditional literature and things like that. But also at the same time, I don't want to leave the impression that the Muslim tradition doesn't itself have built within it this kind of these techniques and early means of critically assessing many of these traditions.
And that they disagreed.
Yeah, exactly. It's a multivocal
there
tradition.
was some dogma, that this is the truth. Like there's a lot of debate over the century.
Yeah. I mean, some of them are still with us. Like one of the most central questions, right? So, so there's a number of properties that the Prophet Muhammad had that he used in order to like feed his family and things like that. And so there's the question of when a prophet dies, what happens to those properties, right? And like every family, good or bad, when someone passes, you tend to have a little bit of arguments. And so one of the main arguments that is kind of still a really long-term difference between some Shia and Sunnis in general is whether or not the Prophet left behind any of his property is heritable. The Shiite position was that the property ought to have been inherited by his daughter Fatima. And the Sunni position was that prophets do not leave behind an inheritance, but rather it becomes the collective property of the community as a whole to be administered by the imam or the caliph. So you'll not find an agreement on that, right?
Right.
And it's been argued over for many centuries. And the arguments themselves I find intrinsically interesting, but I think it would be more or less a fool's errand to say, I, as the historian sitting here in Ohio, I'm going to settle the matter once and for all, that type of thing.
Right. Yeah. No, you just have like a specific part to play in studying the history.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, awesome. It's 1:58, and I do like to keep it to an hour, but I don't want to leave before sharing information for students who at OSU who might want to take your courses, or for people who want to just look you up, read your books, and just learn about what you're doing. Other scholars who might be interested in, I don't know, whatever your projects are, upcoming conferences you're interested in, whatever you'd like to share now about resources people can follow up on. I'm going to take some notes too. So your book is Muhammad and the Empires of Faith. And then what courses are you teaching?
So next fall, I think the thing that's most relevant to what I'm teaching, I think I'm teaching I think I'm teaching Intro to Islam in the fall. But the new course that I'm offering, that's a bit more relevant to everything we're discussing today, is a course on the Islamic Conquest. And so that course on the Islamic Conquest, actually, we go through and we read a lot of the kind of the earliest material evidence, the earliest evidence in Arabic, and we also read all of the not all, but most of the early accounts from the conquered peoples, right, that wrote their stories in Coptic, Greek, and Syriac. Now, we don't read them in the original languages. We read them in English, of course, but we kind of explore the conquest from both perspectives, right, the perspective of the conquerors and then also the perspective of the conquered. So that's in the fall.
Oh, cool. So you actually have some translated Syriac, Coptic, and Greek texts and stuff like that?
Yeah, what's one thing that's happened a lot, and I would say in the last 30, 35 years or so, there was stuff that was translated before, but this material, its importance has been recognized. It's been evaluated with a lot more kind of careful scrutiny, and it's been more broadly available in English and other languages too. And so that's been really great to see. And sometimes if there is a text that's very important, I mean, it's preserved in obscure language, sometimes I will kind of nudge a colleague that I know to translate something. I had I had a good friend that knows Georgian. Georgian is a very rare language to know. It's a very difficult language to learn as well. And there's a very important source about basically an early Christian martyrdom that's preserved in Georgian. I begged him to translate it, and thankfully he did.
Wow.
So we try to get people to do that have those kind of niche skills. Yeah, I do. Well, we got a grant together to do something else, so I think that I paid it back.
Oh, well, that's good. So what's the grant for, if I can be nosy?
Oh, yeah, I guess we can do it. So the grant was there's right before the Islamic conquest of Palestine in the 7th century, there was actually another conquest right before it in 614 by the Persians. They took Palestine and Jerusalem, all those other stuff away from the Eastern Roman Empire. Mm-hmm. And it was a huge crisis. Eventually, the Eastern Roman Empire takes it back. Mm-hmm. But our most important source for that conquest was originally written in Greek, but it's lost. And it only survives in 2 translations. Well, in translations in 2 languages, I should say. And the first translation is in Old Georgian. And this is, of course, Georgia of the Caucasus, not Georgia of the peaches. Right. And the other one is Christian Arabic. So I translated the Christian Arabic, and my colleague Stephen Shoemaker translated the Georgian. And so we're kind of finishing that up. We've been delayed by COVID, like everybody else. And so that will be coming out hopefully soonish when we finish it up. We're going to meet together over the summer, but it's mostly done. And also, I have another translation that's coming out. It's an early biography of a very important early caliph from the Umayyad period. His name is Omar ibn Abdulaziz. He's called Omar II. He's called the 5th rightly guided caliph. It's the first biography written about any caliph in the Arabic language. And so I re-edited the Arabic text from a newly discovered.
What's the title of the translation?
So the title, I haven't decided on the title yet, but it's probably going to be something like the achievements of Omar Abdulaziz or something like that. But in Arabic, for those who are interested, it's called Sirat Omar ibn Abdulaziz. So it's called a Sirah, just like the same title that's attributed to a lot of the early biographies of the Prophet Muhammad. So Sirah
Omar ibn Aziz.
Yeah.
Got it. First biography in Arabic.
Ibn Abdulaziz, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's Abdulaziz, yeah. Otherwise, it'd be called the Son of God. so Ibn Abdulaziz. I can write it down.
Got it. First biography in Arabic of a caliph.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Fascinating. So you've got this new course coming up about the Islamic conquest. That sounds really exciting. And just to clarify, students don't have to speak Arabic to take it, or should they speak Arabic a little bit?
Yeah, there's no prerequisites for it whatsoever. No. So it's all in English.
That's exciting. Yeah. Great opportunity. And then any other courses that you're going to be teaching next year? That
let's see. I had to remember my schedule. I know I'm going to definitely be teaching a course on the Qur'an and translation as well. Okay, but that's probably going to be in the spring.
That sounds great. And when we say Qur'an and translation, just to clarify, we're talking about it's a class in English. Again, like you don't necessarily. Yeah. It might help if you know some Arabic, but it's a class in English.
Not necessary. Yeah. So our department has 2 courses. So we have a course for Arabic majors about the Qur'an in Arabic, and then I teach the Qur'an and translation, which is more an introduction to the modern scholarly study of the Qur'an.
Okay.
In the Western Academy.
Good to know. All stuff that helps me out too when I'm writing about our work at Ohio State. So I really appreciate it. And it sounds like you've been really busy with your research. Are you excited to have this translation finally coming out soon?
Right now it's in the draft form where I have to go through and hopefully find all of my mistakes and things like that and bring it to the final polished face. It's been a real slog. This is like the least fun part of it. So I'm already getting it done, but it's definitely a lot of grinding is still left to bring.
Massive amount of work.
Final product. Yeah.
Well, best of luck on that. May you find the concentration you need for that. And I really appreciate you taking time out, because I know how busy, how much work you're doing, and with teaching and everything. It's a lot. So really appreciate you taking some time out just so we can get to know you, get to know your work and your words. And is there anything else, any other resources you want to share before we sign off?
Nothing off the top of my head. You could check out our department on Elk. We got a lot of courses and stuff. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Yep. Okay. Well, very, very interesting conversation. And I hope that, we've enlightened our audience about, the amazing opportunities at Ohio State to learn about not only, Arabic speaking communities of the past, but Syriac, Coptic, and Coptic is a language of Egypt that's kind of Pharaonic, but Greek.
It's a synod of Demotic, and it's written with a modified Greek alphabet. It has multiple dialects. Actually, we have some really great Coptologists at Ohio State too, like David Brackey in particular. It's a very important language still for the study of the New Testament and things like that, and really Christianity. So.
Yeah, and it's still, it's still used, I think, in the church in Egypt, right?
It's a liturgical language.
Yeah.
So a lot of the Eastern churches, folks may know, Roman Catholic Church, they use Latin in their liturgy, or Greek Orthodox, they tend to use Greek, and then Syrian Orthodox, they tend to use Syriac, and then Coptic Orthodox tend to use Coptic, etc. Yeah.
There you go. There you have it. Well, awesome. We have one more question. Since Abraham through Jewish genealogy tree, and get along well with the Arabs. I think he's just talking about there's like an affinity there because Abraham's kind of the great grandfather of Arabs and Hebrews and Jews.
Yeah.
So
everybody's interested in Abraham. It's one of the reasons why they call it Abrahamic faiths, right? Right. It's a modern designation, the Abrahamic faiths, but I don't find it too objectionable.
Okay.
It is a good reminder of what we have in common humanity and things like that. I agree with the sentiment.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. There are a lot of similarities between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but also a lot of differences as well. And that's the beauty of studying not only those religions, but the regions they come from. So,
yeah.
All right. Well, I'm going to close it there. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.